Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the first of a series of lectures in this class. And I want to start by asking everybody, what is history? Now, I had you fill out that opening discussion post about what you think it was, and there were some pretty good answers on there. And now I'd like to move on to what I learned history was when I was in your shoes many, many years ago. And the teacher got up to the front of the room and he wrote history on the board and he circled his and story. And for a long time, that's what history was as a discipline. It was the study of, let's just say, great white men. We're trying to move away from that these days in history. And so, another place I'd like to kind of begin is by telling you what I don't think history is exclusively. And so, on the next slide here, I just pulled up a Google image of what is history, and this on the right here came up, and I see Napoleon Bonaparte and a samurai warrior, maybe some Spanish Armada ships, some Greek hoplites, and I'm noticing an awful lot of leaders and kings and battles going on. And I want to tell you that that is really the popular image of history, but we want to keep in mind that history is not just exclusively facts and dates and numbers. There are a lot of those in history, but that's not really the exclusive limits of what history is. It's also not just the story of rulers and kings and leaders. This year, we're going to go over an awful lot of people who aren't in charge of something. And this final little section here is wars and battles. Now, there are an awful lot of wars and battles in history, but I don't want our image of what history is to be exclusively wars and battles. There is certainly all three of these little bullet points I put on here in history, but that is not exclusively what it is. And now, just to kind of illustrate that, if you follow me to the next slide, these are the different types of historians we have. So, on that previous slide, you would think that maybe it's just political and military history, but if you follow along with me here, there are an awful lot of sub-disciplines within the discipline of history. And feel free to pause this if you want to go through them one by one. But for example, you could be some kind of geographic historian or temporal historian, and you can combine these. So you could say, I am a ancient Chinese historian. These are just the kinds of things that you can mix and match here. And if you go down the list, you can see a whole number of different histories that you could study in the discipline of history. And this is not an exhaustive list. There certainly are more than just what is available here in the discipline. And so when we talk about when the discipline was founded as an actual science, we can look at maybe political history and military history, maybe some economic and social history, certainly religious history, and you can still study those if you want to. But those are not really the exclusive realm of what history is anymore. And just for an example of what I am a late 19th and early 20th century American political and social historian. So I look at both the leaders and the everyday person. I care about what individuals thought about in the early 20th century and the late 19th century. And so the sources I would use for that are just looking at newspaper clippings or old journals or diaries. And so those are the kinds of things you would look at if you were a historian. And now there are a couple of major categories of history which I want you to all be familiar with. And as you're going through here, feel free to pause it if you want to look at them a little bit more in depth. So there are three major categories of finding history, and those are pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. We have our oral, our written, and our physical categories. So when you think about oral histories, I want you to think about maybe some events or stories passed down over time. The oral histories don't necessarily mean somebody was speaking. When I ask for an example of this, oftentimes students will say, "Oh, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech because he delivered that orally." Well, I know that's a little tricky because I mean, he spoke that speech, but it's actually a written piece of evidence. And on our discussion board, I think we can go into a little bit more depth on that one. But when I'm thinking of oral history, I think of sort of oral stories transmitted over time. And the best example I can think of is maybe Native American history. Before Europeans show up, there is no real written records of Native Americans living in North America, and so their traditions would have been passed down orally. So those oral histories are what we're looking for there. In terms of written history, this is probably the easiest one, the one that you're most familiar with. These are documents, things that people wrote down. You're thinking from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, to individual diaries and journals. in 200 years, when long after I've passed away, when somebody wants to look at the life of Timothy Regan, they'll probably look for my diary to write a story about me, because that's the kind of written testimony that I have left behind. So think about in your own life what kind of written records you're leaving for the next generation. And then this final category is physical history, and this is the stuff, what I like to call the stuff that you find. So going out into your backyard and digging up some dirt to try and find maybe some arrowheads or dinosaur bones. That's physical history, things that you can touch and feel. Now, those are our categories of finding history, but there's some other things I just want you to be aware of as we go through this class. And the first one here is our calendar, and there's been a bit of a discrepancy between textbook publishers and who uses which particular year method. And so we're looking at the years. We look at maybe AD or CE, and then BC and BCE, and I think we kind of have our own personal preferences. But I want to tell you that in our calendar, it really makes sense to use the AD and the BC, but I guess beginning about the time I was in elementary school, we really moved towards the CE, BCE, and I just want to let you know that either are acceptable because they both make sense in our class, in this class setting. Because the way the calendar works, and you don't have to be religious for this to make sense, but our calendar dates from the birth of Jesus Christ. And so to say AD, that's Anno Domini for you Latin fans, that means, in the year of our Lord. So his divinity is kind of up to you, but it makes sense in our calendar. So if you're reading something and it says AD, or you're reading something and it says CE, which is the common era, kind of to secularize sort of our calendar, either are acceptable. I just want to make you aware of that. And I've listed some examples on the right here of different calendars around the world and how they date things. And so, for example, in ancient Rome, they would have used their calendar system from the founding of the city and before the founding of the city. So they weren't talking about living in 500 BC before the birth of Christ because they didn't know that that was going to happen yet. So they date things from the founding of the city and before the founding of the city. And you can find this in pretty much every calendar around the world. So maybe if you want to look up some more examples of that, that would be a fun activity. There's some more concepts I have here, history versus prehistory, and there's a bit of a debate about if there even is such a thing as prehistory, because what happens before people, right? Well, there's no such thing, right? This is all history. But in general, as you're reading through the textbook, a lot of them will say history is written, prehistory is unwritten. So that's just something else to be aware of. And then your hundreds versus century, I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with this one. When we talk about the year 1900s to 1999, you'll think, oh, it's obviously the 19th century, right? 1919th. Well, no, it's a tricky one. You always have to count up one, and it works the same in reverse in the BC era, because there is no such thing as the 0th century. So that year 1 to 99 is the first century. And then we keep counting upwards that way. Now, there's one more concept I want you to be aware of, and it's something we're desperately trying to avoid in the modern world, and that is called Eurocentrism. Now, Eurocentrism is kind of what it sounds like, telling the story of history from a very European perspective. And when I bring up this map here, you can see what I'm talking about here when we talk about, say, East Asia. Well, East in relation to what? East Asia over here, meaning China and Korea and those areas. It's like East in relation to what? Well, it's very much east of Europe, right? And when we talk about the Middle East, for example, too. So this general area here, that's we're looking at Middle East. East from what? Again, east from Europe. And then when we think about the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, that is also really there's a dividing line down pretty much the center of Europe, where everything west of it is west and everything east of it is east. So that's something that we're trying to move away from. In this class, I really want to talk about the story of people without a European perspective. And sometimes that's difficult because so much of history has been written from a Eurocentric perspective, but we are going to try and avoid that as we go along here. Now, as we go along in this semester, I'm going to introduce you to a whole bunch of sources. And there are two main kinds of sources in history. I think once you get into the sciences, you'll see such a thing as a tertiary source. So don't let that confuse you. We only have two real sources in the history discipline, and those are primary sources and secondary sources. And my easy, dumb definition for those is a primary source is somebody who made it, saw it, or did it. A secondary source, that's people like us writing about it, right? So these are um, distinct, but you can kind of figure out the difference between them if you just think about it for a second. And there are going to be some confusing ones, but we'll go over those as we go through here. And don't be shy if it takes you a while to get this. I was a history major all my life, and it took me until I was a junior before I figured out the difference between primary and secondary sources. And so if you have more questions about this, we can certainly keep talking about it on the discussion board. And I'm going to make it very evident when I give you those hat questions that you read about in the syllabus. I'm going to make it very evident which ones of those are primary and which ones of those are secondary. So I just wanted to list a couple examples here. So the first paper I ever presented, A Non-Christian Republic, Thomas Jefferson on the Private Role of Religion in the New Republic. That is secondary because I used the Declaration of Independence, uh, Thomas Jefferson's writings, the Constitution of Virginia to write that. So I used primary sources to write that. And then on the right here is the Declaration of Independence, which is primary because they were there, they saw it, they did it, they made it, and that's what makes it primary. And now we'll just move on to a couple more things I want to tell you about. In this class, we're going to see an awful lot of maps. Now, I love maps. I think they're beautiful. I have maps around my house, just sort of old maps because I like them so much. But I want you to remember that they can be very misleading. And so I've got two maps of Africa right here, and I'm going to keep picking on Africa, and it's going to make sense why in a second. But on the left here, this is called the Murdoch ethnic map, and this is the first real attempts to list all the ethnicities of Africa um, by any sort of professional discipline. And so I think Murdoch was a sociologist, and we can, if we look hard enough, we can find maybe 10,000 different ethnicities on this map. And so on the right here, these are sort of the modern borders. They're, not quite modern. We're missing South Sudan over here. It's just one country at this time. But these are generally the modern borders. And you can see that those ethnicities don't necessarily match up with the modern borders. So always think about this, that there are sort of arbitrary borders in a lot of places on a lot of these maps we're looking at. And that's just something to be aware of. Just because everybody lives in Algeria here doesn't mean that they're all ethnically Algerians. They might be, as part of a nationalism issue, Algerians, but they're ethnically very different. And to keep with Africa here, modern maps are really misleading in terms of size. So just I'll show you on the next map also that Africa is actually a lot bigger than it looks like. It's just the way that we look at maps makes it look a lot smaller. So I just sort of crudely copy and paste it. This is the United States, this is India, and this is sideways China, where over 2 billion people live in these countries. Over 300 million of us live in America. And so it looks a lot bigger on a regular map, these three countries do, but you can see on a proper map, all three of these countries can fit right into Africa with room to spare. And so I want to show you this map also. This is really a more accurate representation of what the world looks like. So these are just things to keep in mind as we go along here, how misleading maps can be. And so that's just a general introduction to a couple of things in this class. If you'll join me in the next video, we'll go over some of those historical thinking skills that I really want you to be aware of this semester. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a message on that discussion board. I'm happy to discuss history. I get really excited about history, so I hope that you all do also. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this short video, and I will see you on the next one.